After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Jerusalem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it was stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and incense and myrrh. What's wrong with this picture? Now, we talked about this a bit last week. What's wrong with the picture we have of... This is like any Christmas card, isn't it?
Oh, is it about, like, we don't know how many...
Yeah, we don't know how many wise men there were, because they brought 3 gifts.
They don't come together with the shepherds.
Yeah, that's right. The Bible says they, so we know it was 2, but it doesn't say how many. Now, there's a lot more wrong with this picture, actually. Sometimes we don't know what we think we know. There's a program on TV, I don't like it. I find them quite offensive. But the whole premise of QI is that you don't know what you think you know. Or what you think you know is not right. And there's a lot about this we think we know, but we don't know. So, who's this? That was David Livingstone. David Livingstone, the famous explorer and missionary from 150 years ago, who traipsed through Africa. He looked for the source of the River Nile. He discovered what he called Lake Victoria, Victoria Falls, which he named after the Queen, Queen Victoria. And we have this image in our mind of Livingstone going through Africa on his own, cutting through the jungle. He famously fought off a lion, and then he bumped into the man who went out to look for him at one point because he hadn't been heard of for a long time. Not him, called Henry Stanley. And we have this image in our minds that the 2 of them were going through Africa. But now, David Livingstone, when he set out on his last journey, he had 114 people helping him. Servants, porters, carrying all the equipment, the tents and the bed and probably the gramophone record. I don't know what these people did. But Henry Stanley, when he went looking for him, paid by the newspaper to go and find him, he had 230 with him to help him get through Africa. Now, this is Edmund Hillary in 1953. Edmund Hillary, what did he do? He climbed Everest. He was the first man to climb Everest. Happened to be the same day as our Queen was coronated, became Queen. But he was adamant in all the build-up to it and very strong with the press to say it is not just me. He said, I've gone with my Sherpa, Tenzing Norgay. So you must include the 2 of us in your reporting. And if you look up online the reports, the newspaper reports, they all say Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. But only because Edmund Hillary was adamant that Tenzing Norgay got the recognition as well. But what they don't tell you is that when they set off from base camp, though it takes 5 or 6 days to get to base camp, doesn't it? When they set off, they had 400 people with them. 400 people with them. You see, when you make a huge journey, you can't just go on your own. You need loads of things with you. Now, the wise men, here's Jerusalem. They came from the east. Now, it's at least 900 miles. It took them at least 4 months. Some people, they disagree, the experts in these things, somewhere between 4 months and 2 years to make this journey. They needed to carry food. They needed to have enough money to get through everything they needed to do. They had their tents. They had their camels. They would have needed somebody there in case somebody got sick, some sort of medication or medical person. They're very wealthy men, these wise men. So they needed security as they went through these unknown lands. So they too would have had a whole load of people with them. So when we see a picture of 3 men on camels, we have to think maybe there was 2, maybe there was 32. We don't know. But what about all the others who no doubt went with them and made the same journey? Now, I was trying to think, how would you film this? How would you make this into a film? We need to sometimes enter into the scripture and put ourselves in the position, try and imagine it, how it played out. So if you think yourself as Steven Spielberg, or better, Peter Jackson, because Peter Jackson, he made 2 amazing films about journeys, didn't he? Well, actually 6 films, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, about these amazing journeys. We need to think about how they would portray these people, these men, these however many of them there were. They were people who studied the stars, and somebody would have discovered this star and then brought together his friends and said, what is this thing we found? What does it mean? Does it mean anything at all? And they would have gone through this process. But where were they? Now, this is a question, again, which they don't know. But there's a very strong school of thought that says they are probably from Babylon. The Babylon was in the east, from Jerusalem. A very big, powerful nation. In fact, they had conquered Israel a few hundred years before. And they were very, very powerful, very well known. And it could well be that when Matthew wrote his gospel, when they said from the east, people would automatically think, oh, Babylon. It's like if we say, oh, somebody's come up from the south, we think, oh, they come from London. It's just an assumption. It might be that. We don't know. But as we think about Bible history, in the book of Daniel, we learn that when Babylon conquered Israel, Judah, Babylon grabbed the young, the intelligent of the leaders, the aristocracy, the noblemen, the young, fit, strong, bright noblemen. They took them off into captivity, and there Nebuchadnezzar arranged for them to be taught in the ways of the Babylonians. This is about 605 years before Jesus was born. And we read that they were forced to learn the language of the Babylonians, the history, the culture, the religion, the way people behaved, etc. It was very good strategy as the conquering nation to assimilate the leaders into their culture, and then hopefully that would encourage the Israelites, the people of their nation, to do as they're told and to accept their lot. And Daniel chapter 1 tells us that Daniel and his friends, we know particularly about 3 of them, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, but they were very clever. They had knowledge beyond their years. And Daniel in particular, God gave him the ability to interpret dreams and visions. Now in chapter 2 of Daniel, the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he had a very disturbing dream, which really upset him. And he called together all the experts in Babylon, his own people. Now, the Bible tells us they were magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, because science and superstition would have been all mixed up. Magi. That's where we get the word Magi, M-A-G-I, magic, magicians, the same thing. He called all his people together. Tell me what my dream means. And they said, it's impossible. Nobody can interpret this dream. We have no idea. But then Daniel, this captive, this young man, it came to be that he was told the dream and he was able to interpret the dream because God enabled him to do so. So then the king put Daniel in charge of Babylonia, and we're particularly told in charge of the Magi, the intellectuals, the scientists, yes, it's all mixed up with magic and all this stuff, but this was their concept, this was their understanding. And so I think it's brilliant, this, because what it means is that this great man of God, devoted to the one true God, he was in charge of the universities. And we can easily imagine that he brought into the curriculum the faith of the Jewish people, the one true God, how he had behaved, what their scriptures, what he was going to do, what he was like, etc., etc. So you can imagine this coming into the academic culture of Babylon and then being passed down the generations. So come the time of Jesus, the Magi at that time would have been well acquainted with the Jewish faith and what was involved. And that included one day God would send the Messiah. But one day he would come. The King of the Jews would come to earth. So isn't it brilliant that God used this historical context, this cultural context, the development of this pagan nation, to instill in a group of highly intelligent, highly educated, wealthy, influential men a longing for the one true God. To ask him to act, to appear before them, to lead them on. Now, he was a foreign God. He had last spoken 16 generations previously. 16 generations, 400 years. And I thought maybe that'd be a bit like somebody in North Korea, completely cut off, completely isolated from outside influences, having heard down through the generations something of our wonderful God. And somebody in North Korea today, wanting God, seeking God, praying to God, longing for God, even though the last time anyone in their culture had had a direct conversation or direct input from God was in the time of King Charles I, 1600. So no wonder this group of Magi were excited. God has spoken. We are convinced this is the fulfillment of the Jewish faith, the Jewish longing. So this is a strong school of thought that says they probably came from Babylon. Now, if you want to travel from Babylon to Jerusalem, you can't just go in a straight line. Why not, Harry? Yeah, that's one thing. Good. What's this say here? The desert. You couldn't make that journey. So there's this area called the Fertile Crescent. So if you see the river going up there, this is the way people traveled from east to west and west to east. They would have gone up and then down. Yes, they came from the east, but obviously when they came to Jerusalem from the north, because they went up the Fertile Crescent where there was water and food, etc., etc. Now this journey would take several months, if not years, as Harry said, through foreign and hostile terrain, crossing borders. Now, we used to live on the very edge of the European Union, at the very edge of the European Union. And you might have heard of Fortress Europe, because the border between the European Union and outside the European Union, where we lived, was a massive fence, twice the height of this room, maybe even 3 times, with cameras in it, pepper spray in it, guards going up and down, dogs either side. It was impossible to get across that border without going through the gate, although some men tried to do so and they would clamber over, get caught on the razor wire, cut themselves to pieces. There was a similar sort of border, but these wise men had to cross the Roman Empire. Not the European Empire, which we've just left, but the Roman Empire. They had to cross that border. As I say, on this journey, they had to think about people falling ill. They had to think about language interpreters as they went from one place to another, people who speak the languages, etc., etc. So a long journey, a hard journey, a very expensive journey, and a dangerous journey. But what they did when they got to journey's end, was the logical thing to do. They were going to the land of the Jews, to Jerusalem, their capital city, Daniel's hometown, the center of Judaism, where God lived in his temple, or had done. And so they went to the king's palace. They were going to the king of the Jews. They went to the king's palace to find the king. Now, Herod was not a true king. Herod was put in Jerusalem to control the Jews from the Roman Empire. He was like the mayor of Jerusalem. But he liked to refer to himself as the king of the Jews because he was in charge of the Jewish people, and he knew they had this belief in the true king of the Jews that would come one day, and he was a very arrogant man, and he liked to call himself the king of the Jews. So when the wise men turned up and they went to the palace and they found King Herod, they would have thought, this is not the sort of man that God was bringing. He was a tyrant. He was ruthless. He killed even members of his own family because he thought they were threatening him, wanting to take over his role. He was decadent, which meant he had wild living of all sorts of different things. So they would arrive there and found, this is not the king of the Jews we've come for. Well, the Jewish leaders, the spiritual leaders in Jerusalem, were able to fill in the gaps in the wise men's knowledge and tell them exactly where the Messiah was to be born, according to the scriptures, in Bethlehem, in this little village 6 miles outside of Jerusalem. Now, the Magi were very clever people. They were very educated. They had great knowledge. And one of the key parts of their knowledge was there were things they didn't know. They didn't know everything. They needed help to fully understand. And that's part of being clever, isn't it? That's part of being wise, is knowing that you don't know everything. But they went along with what the wisdom, the local knowledge, the local wisdom told them, that the Messiah would not be in the palace, in the capital city, but he would be in their little village down a dusty track 6 miles away. So after all their planning, and they wouldn't have just one day said, let's go and follow this star, and hopped on their camel and off they went, like we do in the car. It would have taken a long time to plan their journey. Their journey was long and harsh, and no doubt had hiccups along the way. I wonder how they felt when eventually they turned up in this little dusty village in the middle of nowhere, no proper roads, no proper communications, nobody of great importance. I wonder if they felt an anticlimax. I wonder if they felt, we've come all this way and we've ended up in this little place. Now, we don't know where Jesus was when they found him. If he was actually in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem even. And we don't know how old he was when the wise man came. The stories tell us they turned up the same day as the shepherds did. As in my pitch at the beginning, you have the shepherds at one side and you have the wise men on the other. So the question came to me, when did that star first appear? Did it appear the day Jesus was born? If that is the case, then they could not have seen Jesus until he was at least 4 months old, probably nearer 2 years old, which would tie in with Herod saying, kill all the babies, all the children under 2 years old. And logically, he wouldn't still be in the stable, would he? Might be living in a house in Bethlehem. Maybe not even in Bethlehem at all. Or did the star appear many months before Jesus was born to get the wise men on the journey? so they would turn up and give their gifts and their worship to Jesus when he was actually born in the stable. Well, if that's the case, that means that God spoke to them through this star before the angel spoke to Mary and she conceived. It's fascinating, isn't it? There's so much in this story I hadn't thought about before. So what we see is that the Magi, they made their plans, they had their expectations, but God had made his plans for them. And they didn't know what those plans were, but they unfolded as the wise men went along. Now, at the beginning of 2020, I'm sure we all had some sort of plan for the year. Maybe quite a definite plan, maybe pretty vague general ideas. But we all had certain expectations a year ago. There were certain things we assumed would happen, places we would go, people we would see, etc. Now, I got up 263 days ago, and I had no expectation 363 days ago. But come 2020, I'd have lost 10% of my fingers. I got that wrong. That was not in my head at all when I got up on the 3rd of December. Even though I lost my finger, beginning of 2020, I had the assumption that during the year, Sharon and I would move away from Doncaster and move somewhere else in the country where I would take up the leadership of a local church and have a whole new chapter of our lives. I got that wrong. That's not what happened. This time last year, we gave no thought to the possibility, didn't we, that we would not be able to go on holiday. Of course we go on holiday every year. But we would not be able to sit in coffee shops or restaurants. It'd be ridiculous to think like that. We didn't think that we'd be spending months sat at home, or that we'd all be wearing face masks. I never imagined the day would come when I would put a mask on, go into a bank and demand they give me money. But that day happened, didn't it? That day came. If you had told me a year ago that the UK government would ban us from going to church for 4 months and then only let us back into church if we promised not to sing God's praise, I would have said, you're mad. This is not Saudi Arabia. This is England. But I was wrong. Now, I wonder if last Christmas you bought somebody, or somebody bought you, or you bought yourself a 2020 year planner. Well, if you did, what a waste of money. Well, completely useless. We might have had sensible plans. We might have had reasonable plans. We might have had wise plans, God-centered, humble plans. They came to nothing. So 2020 should be remembered, I think, as the year when God showed us that we aren't as in control as... And those of us who are committed Christians, we say we believe it, but I wonder deep down if we really do. If we do actually live as though I'm in control. I'm in charge. I'm going to control my family. I'm going to control my career. I'm going to control my finances, etc. We think we have everything in control. Now, yesterday on the radio, I heard something really interesting. There's a program called Saturday Live on Radio 4. And we enjoy this program, and it's always interviewing with interesting people. And they had a lady on yesterday, a very posh lady, a very upper-class lady, by the name of Lady Anne Tennant, Baroness Glenconner. Now, she'd been a maid of honour at the coronation of our Queen. She was a very close friend of Princess Margaret. And she was part of the party set, if you know anything about the royal family in the 60s and 70s. Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, spent a lot of time on this island called Mustique in the Caribbean. And they had wild parties, decadent sort of parties. Well, Lady Anne Tennant, her husband owned the island of Mustique. She's that sort of person. And she's a very close friend of Princess Margaret. Very well-to-do lady, very wealthy, a life of great privilege and every advantage. Or so it appeared. Her husband treated her very badly, had affairs and different things. And when he died, he left his massive fortune. He rewrote his will. He left his massive fortune to an employee. Wrote his family out completely. They had 5 children, twin daughters and 3 sons. The first son died of a drug overdose. The second son died of AIDS. And the third son was very badly injured in a motorcycle crash. He was in a coma for a long time, and his brain damaged even today. She said, Lady Ann Tennant yesterday, that she learned to forgive her husband all that he did to her, that hurt her. And she said she has forgiven the man who was responsible for the crash that led to her third son's accident. She says she has a strong faith in God. She believed that God filled her with the energy needed to get through each tragedy. And Richard Coles, the BBC's favourite vicar, who hosts this programme, he immediately commented that people often think God exists purely to console them. And yet this perspective that she had, that God gave her the energy, not so much to console her through her losses, but the energy to carry her through. He said, oh, that's very interesting. Now, Richard Coles is a very liberal sort of a vicar. He would never say it, but it came into my mind when David says in Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. This is an interesting idea. I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but God gives me the energy to keep walking, to get through it. But God enables us to do that. Well, Lady Ann Tennant said she's very happy in life. She loves life, even with all this tragedy in her life. And she thanks God for her life. I thought, wow, there's a message there for us, isn't there? To cope with what God allows into our lives. So as we sit here on the edge between 2020 and 2021, I think we need to embrace what the Bible teaches about making plans. And it says quite a lot of things. One, it is good to plan for the future. Proverbs 15:22. Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. So Solomon is saying here, make your plans, but seek wisdom from other people, and then they'll go better. That's a good thing. But also in the same book, Proverbs says, our plans may well fail, but God's plans never fail. Many are the plans in a person's mind, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. So it's good to make plans, but we need to remember that God's plans never fail. But there's a good thing in that as well, because Psalm 45 tells us that God's plans are for our good. Many, O Lord my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you have planned for us, no one can recount to you. So it's good to plan for the future, but we need to remember that God's plans are the ones that will prevail. But it's okay because God plans for our good, not for our evil. And therefore, we make our plans, but we hold on to them lightly. We trust God to know what is best. As James teaches us, now listen you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to this city or that city, spend a year here, carry on business there, make money there, make our plans, when you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. All in the area of making our plans. Now, the Magi's plans were good, but God's plans were better. Joseph never planned to be rejected by his brothers, but they left him for dead, or they were going to leave him for dead, weren't they? And then they sold him into slavery. He never planned that he would be thrown into jail for years. And then when he got the chance of getting out of jail, he was forgotten about for another 2 years. But God's plan for Joseph was good. And when he met his brothers again, in Exodus, I think it's 50, Genesis 50, Joseph had such faith in God that he could say You planned for evil, but God planned for good. God's plans were the ones that came through. King David, he planned for years to build God a temple he was worthy of. And he taxed the Israelites so highly, almost crippling the country, to pay for this enormous project, this building project. But God planned it. But David wouldn't build the temple, but his son would, Solomon. Moses, he planned an armed uprising against the oppressive Egyptians who were treating the people as slaves. But God's plan didn't involve that. God's plan then sent Moses into the desert for 40 years. And then to come back, and God gave Moses and the people a miraculous deliverance. God's plan was better than Moses' plan. Job, this man who suffered so terribly, most awful things. He lost all he owned. He lost his children. He lost his place in society. He lost his health. He lost the support of his wife. God rebukes Job for questioning God's plans in his life. I think Job's frustration was quite justified, but God rebukes Job. And then Job came to realize, but he didn't know what he was talking about. And actually, God's plans were better in the end. Going back to Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in a person's mind, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. We had our plans at the beginning of 2020. They were not what we thought. So are we going to be angry? Are we going to be frustrated? Are we going to be depressed? But they didn't come to fruition? Or are we going to cling closer to God, thinking you know best? You can work in our lives in ways we didn't imagine or envisage at all. Here's a song that we may know. And I love the way they put together this video, because it takes the song, which is easy to sing, and they brought it into real lives and the challenge there of what it means to say, blessed be your name, regardless of what may happen.